Thom Hartmann here with you. It's Anything Goes Friday, taking your calls. And David in Buffalo, New York. Hey, David, what's on your mind?
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. Tom, tariffs. If you were to tariff,
yes.
If you were to create our country with tariffs in the past, in the present, and in the future, what would tariffs look like? Why? And could you put a number to it, or would you put a number with it?
Sure. First of all, I refer you to the introduction and the first chapter of my book, Rebooting the American Dream, which you can read for free online over at the truthout.org website. And click on Thom Hartmann on Truthout on their homepage, and then you'll see the picture of the book, and you just click on the cover of the book, and the entire book is there to be read for free online. I don't have it in front of me, so I don't have specific numbers that I can share with you. They are all in that book. But when America started, George Washington, in fact, actually, well, it was, we were operating under the Articles of Confederation. We weren't what we call modern America. The Constitution was adopted in 1789, but the Revolutionary War had been over, I think 5 years earlier than that, and we'd been operating under these Articles of Confederation, which made all 13 states basically independent countries with a free trade agreement among them. It wasn't working, so we rebooted the Constitution. It was proposed in 1787. It was ratified in 1789, and when that was ratified, George Washington was elected president. He was not in the room. He didn't know he'd been elected president. And so he's standing out in his field in Mount Vernon, literally outstanding in his field. And his old friend, General Henry Knox from the Revolutionary War, rides up on horseback and says, "George, you've been elected president. And I'm here to take you to New York," which was then the seat of government. It's where George Washington started presiding from. The White House wasn't built until the John Adams administration. He says, "I'm here to take you to New York. Or do whatever you want." And George said, or President Washington said, "There's two things I'd like you to do, Henry, or one thing I want you to do, one thing I have to do." He said, "What I have to do is I have to visit my mother, who is ailing." And in fact, she died about a year later. He never saw her again. He saw her that one time on his way to New York. But he said, "I have to visit my mother." He said, "What I'd like you to do, Henry, is go up to Connecticut. And there's a guy there whose name is Daniel Hinsdale, and he's a tailor. And he was violating the British embargo and bootlegging, making fine American clothing. It was illegal in the United States to manufacture high-quality clothing all the time the British, controlled our colony, just like they did not allow the Indians to do that in India. Thus, the spinning wheel was the logo for Gandhi, a form of resistance to that policy. All fine clothing that was worn in America had to be manufactured in the mills of Great Britain. And so Hinsdale had been breaking that embargo, and after the Revolutionary War, he openly opened what was America's first fine men's clothing store. And he was making fine men's clothing. And he was basically the only guy doing it. It wasn't that big a market at that point in time. I mean, it was a brand new market. And so George said, take my measurements and take it to Mr. Hinsdale, Daniel Hinsdale, and he'll make a suit for me to be sworn in with. And Knox did that and brought the suit to New York, and George Washington was sworn in, raised his hand, put it on the Bible, the whole bit, wearing a brown American-made suit. Hinsdale did not have a black one at the time in stock that he could provide to Washington on short notice. So then he wore British black for the famous painting that Dolly Madison rescued from the White House and hangs in the White House now. So Washington understood that if we were to become a great country, we had to make things. We had to manufacture things. So he went to his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, in 1789, when he became president, and said, "Would you come up with a way to build American manufacturing?" And Hamilton worked on this for 2 years. And in 1791, he wrote what was called Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton's Report to Congress on American Manufactures. And it was an 11-point plan to build manufacturing in the United States. And it included things like subsidized new and emerging industries, actual government subsidies, Strengthen patent and trademark protections, have Congress pass those laws that the Constitution authorized so that, inventions and useful arts and sciences are enhanced. But the biggest part of it, the main component of it, was tariffs. And the idea of the tariffs was anything that we would appropriately want to import from overseas because we have no interest in manufacturing it in the United States. You don't bother with a tariff. There's going to be a small market in the United States for perfume made out of sandalwood. Well, you can't grow sandalwood in the United States. So we're not going to put a tariff on sandalwood imported from Thailand that's used to make perfume. But on the other hand, if Thailand wants to try and sell clothing in the United States, which we want to be making here, we're going to put a tariff on it. And so that's what they did. And they established this whole spectrum of tariffs. There are now over 22,000 tariff categories. You can read them at commerce.gov. I believe it's commerce.gov, at the website of the U.S. Commerce Department. They're still there. Typical tariffs now are less than 1%. In fact, I think our total average overall tariffs are less than 2%. But typically these tariffs are very, very low. But they're rolled steel, sheet steel, flat steel, pig iron. All kinds of stuff. It's all got these tariff categories. And Hamilton said, do this and raise these average tariffs up to around 20 to 30%, which George Washington did. And they stood that way until the 1980s. And the entire, now tariffs are taxes, right? And in fact, Stephen Moore, the Wall Street Journal guy who used to come on this show and debate me, is trying to get conservatives to start using the language of taxation when referring to tariffs, because he's opposed to tariffs, because he's in favor of, the big businesses and the rich people who get that way because of the big businesses, doesn't give a rat's ass about American workers. But 100% of the income of the United States federal government, George Washington's salary, John Adams' salary, Thomas Jefferson's salary, James Monroe's salary, all the way through to the Civil War, all the way up to Abe Lincoln's salary, 100% of the income to the federal government through that entire period, right up to the Civil War, was from tariffs. It was taxes we imposed on the import of foreign goods. And what that did was it encouraged American steel manufacture. It encouraged Americans to develop companies like, well, a little later on, later in the 1800s, Thomas Edison and his phonograph and Alexander Graham Bell and his telephone and all this stuff, Western Union putting wires all across America. And it was all American-made copper wire and American-made insulation on the copper wire and American-made cars in Henry Ford's factory. Everything was made in America. And this was, this is how we got where we are. From the Civil War until World War II, about 2/3 of the total revenue of the federal government was from tariffs. Excuse me, World War I. About 2/3 of the revenue from the federal government was from tariffs. And from the end of World War I through the 1980s, about 1/3 of federal revenues. Now, it declined during the 70s. Because it didn't all start under Reagan. Carter was dialing back tariffs. Nixon had been dialing back tariffs. This began with Nixon's outreach to China. But as tariff income went down, tariffs went down. And as the tariffs went down, what happened was we started getting flooded with cheap goods made overseas. And I remember as a kid in the 50s and 60s, if you saw something that said made in Japan, you thought, okay, it's cheap junk, or I'm not going to buy that. I'd rather buy an American-made product. I remember in the 70s, I was living in Michigan. Louise and I lived in Michigan. We grew up in Michigan. And if you had a Toyota or a Hyundai or something like, or Hyundai or any of the, actually Hyundai was not even making cars at that point in time, but if you had a Toyota was the big bugaboo, the big scary, geez, I wonder if bugaboo has a racist origin. I'll bet it does. Anyhow, another word excised from my vocabulary. But if you had a car, a foreign-made car, or even a BMW, but the Japanese cars in particular were seen as dumping into our market, your car would get keyed. People would vandalize your car in the parking lot in Michigan. Louise and I lived in Lansing and in Detroit. And that kind of faded out with Reagan and the collapse of tariffs, and then the collapse of tariffs went into full gear in the 90s with Clinton joining NAFTA or negotiating NAFTA and joining the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which became the WTO. So in my opinion, we should return to Alexander Hamilton's position. And it should be done in the kind of systematic, thoughtful way that Alexander Hamilton did it. And he laid this out, and as I said, you can read his words in my book. It's pretty hard to find online, actually. You can find articles about it, but to actually read Hamilton's words, I reprinted them in the book, Rebooting the American Dream. And like I said, you can read it for free over at truthout.org. You don't have to buy the book. You can also get it in a library. But that was a systemic and organized way of doing things. And what Trump is doing, you know, he and Lighthizer, in my opinion, and the opinion of Sherrod Brown, and the opinion of a lot of good progressives, and in fact, actually pretty much the entire progressive caucus, is that his impulse is correct. We need to protect American manufacturing, and we need to bring back American manufacturing in defiance of these big companies. It is these big companies that have shipped our jobs overseas who are the ones who are unpatriotic. And of course, you know, the presidents and Congresses that have gone along with it. But it is not the Chinese companies that are evil. It's not China that's evil. They're simply taking advantage of our stupid changes in our policies. And then they adopted our policies, by the way, with their own tariff system. China has aggressive tariff systems and things that are the equivalent of tariffs, which Alexander Hamilton also talked about. Non-tariff barriers to trade, like, you know, domestic content components and things. So the problem with the way that Trump is doing it is he's blundering around like a bull in a china shop when, you know, what we should be doing is a systematic, here it is, you know, step by step, these are the industries we're going to protect. And we should also be doing something that we did that Bill Clinton included in the NAFTA negotiations. They knew when they negotiated NAFTA that it was going to cost at least 1 million American jobs. They knew this. They said it out loud. And in fact, in the bill that was passed that authorized the United States to do NAFTA, we created an agency in the government and set aside billions of dollars to retrain over 1 million American workers who would lose their jobs as a result of NAFTA. Now, tragically, and over 1 million Americans actually got retrained, in quotes. The tragedy, though, is that retraining program was largely a joke. The whole thing was largely a joke. It just, you know, it wasn't what we thought it would be. You know, and it was a joke because these for-profit companies stepped into the breach and they were just offering these crappy courses on, you know, here's how you do bookkeeping. Now you can get a job. Well, no, you can't get a job. The jobs are gone. So that's my riff on tariffs. I think we need to go back and every country should protect their own domestic industries, as should we.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And if you look at the history of free trade, what you find is that it's almost always these so-called Main Street Republicans, or Wall Street Republicans, rather, who are in favor of so-called free trade.